October 30th. Elise and Lina's adventure began with an unsettling silence as they stepped off the train in Sighișoara, Romania. The October air was sharp, biting through their jackets. Elise, the older of the two, glanced at her phone. It was almost midnight. They could see the towering silhouette of the Sighișoara fortress above them, illuminated by the moon's pale light. "I can't believe we have to hike all the way up there," Lina exclaimed, feeling overwhelmed as she tightened her scarf around her neck. The cobbled path twisted up the hill, the trees casting long skeletal shadows in the dim glow of flickering lamps. The fortress appeared larger with each step. Its round arches came out of the darkness like the mouth of some ancient beast. The old stone walls, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, seemed to whisper secrets. As they approached the imposing fortress gate, Lina paused. "Is it just me? Or does it feel like we're stepping back in time?" Elise smiled, but there was nervousness in her voice. "I mean, this place is medieval. It's supposed to feel old." They walked under the ancient archway, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The narrow streets ahead were cloaked in near-total darkness, illuminated only by a few streetlights, flickering weak, yellowish glimmers. The cold seemed to deepen inside the fortress walls, and their breath fogged in front of them. Suddenly, a burst of motion above startled both girls, making them jump. Something black darted between the roofs of the ancient houses, making strange high-pitched squeaks. Lina grabbed Elise's hand, her heart pounding. "They look like bats," Lina gasped, pointing up at the creatures. Elise forced a laugh, though her nerves were already on the edge. "They can't be. The bats and vampire stories aren't real, you know that." But even as she said it, she couldn't shake off the weird feeling creeping up her spine. The bats, or whatever they were, moved in erratic patterns, gliding low as if circling them. "Let's keep walking. It's late, dark, and I'm tired," Elise urged, pulling Lina along. They continued along the cobbled streets, every step seeming to take them deeper into the past. The air was heavy with the smell of damp stone and autumn leaves. The wind whistled through the cracks in the fortress walls, carrying faint whispers that sounded almost human. The girls stopped in front of an old yellow building. Above the door, they could make out the faded inscription, "Casa Vlad Dracul." Lina's eyes widened. "Wait, isn't this Vlad the Impaler's father's house?" Lina whispered, instinctively stepping closer to her sister. Elise nodded, trying to hold back a shiver. "Yeah, Vlad Dracul lived here, and Vlad the Impaler, Dracula, was born here. That's what it says here on the wall." The thought of standing in front of the birthplace of one of history's most infamous figures sent chills through them both. The house seemed to stare back at them, its windows like empty eyes in the night. A sign creaked on rusty hinges, swinging in the wind. "Do you think the stories are true?" Lina asked, her voice barely audible. "About vampires, I mean." Elise hesitated. "They're just legends. But in a place like this, it's easy to see why people believe them." As they stood in front of Vlad Dracul's house, a gust of wind picked up, scattering a swirl of dead leaves across the street. The bats screeched louder and seemed to be circling the girls now. "Let's go," Elise said abruptly, grabbing Lina's arm. "Our accommodation should be just ahead." As Elise and Lina walked away from Vlad Dracul's house, a deep, echoing chime suddenly filled the air. The clock tower struck midnight. The bells rang out with such force that the vibration seemed to shake the cobbled street and echo through their bones. Each bell ring felt heavier than the one before, reverberating through the ancient stone walls. Lina covered her ears, but it was in vain. The sound was everywhere, surrounding them, as if the fortress itself was waking from a long slumber. Just as the final bell rang out, the air seemed to shift, and in the corner of their eyes, a shadow moved across the cobblestones. Something darker than the night itself. They froze. A cloaked and tall figure came out from the side of the house. Its face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Lina let out a small gasp. "Did you see that?" Elise nodded, her heart racing. The figure didn't move, It just stood there watching them from the shadows. "We need to go now!" Elise shouted nervously, her voice trembling. As they rushed down the winding street, the sound of their footsteps echoed eerily in the silence. Every turn brought them deeper into the maze of narrow alleys, and the feeling of being watched never left them. "There it is!" Elise pointed towards an old sign swinging gently in the wind. It was their accommodation for the night. A small medieval guest house, right in the heart of the fortress, and only a few streets away from Vlad Dracula's house. They approached the front door, which looked as old as the town itself, and were startled by a deep, menacing growl that came from the shadows beside the entrance. A large dog emerged, its fiery gray fur blending into the dim light, making it almost invisible. It was massive, almost wolf-like, with piercing yellow eyes that locked onto the girls. Its growl rumbled like thunder, its fangs flashing in the night as it stood guard. Lina clutched Elise's arm. That looks like a werewolf," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Before they could react, the front door creaked open. An elderly woman appeared, bent over with a pronounced hump on her back, her face hidden beneath a scarf that covered her head. Her gaze never left the ground, and her only visible feature was a large mole on her chin. Without saying a single word, she glared at the monstrous dog. In an instant, the creature fell silent, retreating into the shadows with its eyes still glowing but now dimmed. The old woman handed them the keys to their room, her head bowed, not once speaking or meeting their gaze. Her silence was unnerving, and the air in the small guest house was thick with unspoken tension, but neither girl had the energy to question it. Elise and Lina quickly entered their room, locking the door behind them. "That was strange," Elise muttered as they set down their bags. "Strange? That was terrifying," Lina whispered. "The dog, the woman, didn't you feel it? Something's off about this place." Elise shrugged, trying to shake off her unease. "It's just a really old town, Lina. Everything here feels haunted if you let it." But even Elise couldn't deny the heaviness that clung to the guest house. The stone walls felt too close, the air too still. As they prepared for bed, Lina glanced out the small window. The fortress lay still beneath the moonlight, but the shadows danced in the corners of her vision. She couldn't shake the image of the cloaked figure. "Elise," she whispered, what if that was a vampire?" Elise groaned from her side of the bed. "You're letting this place get to your head, Lina. It was probably just a local or some tourist playing dress up. Let's just sleep." But as the night went on, sleep didn't come easily. The wind howled against the windows, and the shadows seemed to shift and crawl along the walls. At some point, Lina thought she heard scratching at the window, but when she got up to look, there was nothing there, only the empty street and the occasional flicker of bats flying past. October 31st. It was only when the first light of dawn broke over the horizon that the fortress finally felt less menacing. The cobbled streets, which had seemed so frightening the night before, were now bathed in a golden glow. The ancient towers and stone walls stood silent, no longer haunted by the shadows of the night. The girls woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside their window. Lina stretched and peeked outside. "Much better," she sighed with relief. "It looks almost peaceful." Elise turned to Lina with a shaky smile. "See? Just an old town with too many spooky legends." They dressed up, eager to explore more of what Sighișoara had to offer. But as they stepped out of the room, they froze. The old lady from the previous night stood at the guest house entrance, but something seemed different. She no longer had the hunched back, her scarf was gone, and the large mole on her chin had vanished. She looked younger, vibrant even, with an open smile that was completely at odds with the terrifying figure they had encountered the previous night. Beside her, the massive gray-furred dog had changed too. Instead of the wolf-like beast, there stood a much smaller, friendlier dog with soft and playful eyes. Lina blinked in disbelief. "Good morning, young ladies. I hope you slept well," the girls heard the woman saying in a smooth and clear voice. Elise and Lina exchanged confused glances but nodded. The transformation was impossible to ignore, but they were too disoriented to ask questions. The woman's smile faded as she leaned in closer. "Be careful today," she said in a low, grave, almost conspiratorial tone. "You see, today is October 31st, and tonight we pass into November. In our tradition, this is when the veil between the living and the dead is thinnest. Souls rise, especially those who have been forgotten, those whose families have not lit a candle at their grave." Elise felt a cold chill creep down her spine. What? What happens if no one comes to light a candle? The woman's eyes darkened, and her grave voice took on an even heavier tone. "Then, those souls will wander, restless, raging, and they will roam freely through the fortress, searching for someone to—" Before she could finish, the sound of footsteps interrupted her. New guests entered the guest house, breaking the tension. The woman's demeanor changed instantly, her face brightening again as she turned to greet them. Elise and Lina exchanged a nervous glance. The girls stepped out into the fortress, but the woman's unfinished warning echoed in their minds. "Searching for someone to what?" Lina muttered, glancing around the quiet streets. "I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to find out," Elise replied, her eyes scanning the ancient walls as they made their way toward Vlad Dracula's house once more. The fortress was alive with history, but now with the old woman's warning hanging over them, it felt different. Every shadow, every flicker of movement seemed to hide something more. They could only hope that whatever was still lingering in the fortress didn't find them before the day ended.